Have you ever had a machine that would start and run one day, but the next time you tried to use it, it didn't work? Well, as you might have guessed it, that's what's going on with this blower, and it can be very irritating to say the least. Now, I have someone who'd like to have this blower, so I have to figure out what's going on with it before I give it to them. Otherwise, this blower might have to be used as a parts machine, or worse yet, go somewhere where it doesn't want to be, in the trash can. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this very orange leaf blower, and the problem is that it's very tough to start, but most times it simply won't start. Now, I got this blower from someone who didn't take care of it very well, and unfortunately, I think that lack of care has finally caught up with it. Now, I'm going to try and repair this blower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things aren't working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. So if you take a close look at this blower, you'll notice that it's in really good condition. However, just because they didn't throw it around doesn't mean it's in good working condition. Now, this machine was left idle with fuel in the tank for long periods of time, and if you're using ethanol gasoline, this has a way of damaging parts of the fuel system. The first and one of the most important things to check for is that the engine is not worn out. And the quickest way to find out is to slowly pull on the rope and feel if the engine is putting up a good fight. And fortunately for us, this one is doing a great job at doing that, and from experience, I'd say this engine was very healthy. So even though the last owner did a poor job of maintaining it, at least they knew how to mix 2-cycle oil and gasoline correctly. Next, I want to try and start the blower and see what it does and doesn't do, which might help us to figure out what's wrong with it. So we've got good news and we've got bad news. Well, the bad news is that we weren't able to get it to start and run, but the good news is that it did try and start for one very brief second. Now, I know that we figured out that the engine was not worn out, but we need to confirm this with a compression tester just to be sure. Once installed, the tester will measure how much pressure the engine can make, and the more pressure, the better. But if it's not able to make enough pressure, the engine will not be able to start and run. So the reading is 150 psi, which confirms that this engine is extremely healthy and has more than enough compression to start and run. And if you get a reading less than this, it just means the engine does have some wear on it. But if the reading was less than 90 psi, I'd be very concerned about there being too much wear on the engine. Next, I want to test for spark from the ignition system. So as you just saw, it did take a couple of pulls, but after a bit, we did have good spark near the end. Now that we've confirmed that we have plenty of compression from the engine and good spark from the ignition system, that just leaves us with a fuel issue. So as you just saw, I tried to start it, but this time I didn't use the choke and finally got the engine to start and run. So from this last test start, I think I know what's wrong with this machine. It would seem that this carb has a tendency to flood the engine. So when you try and start it, according to the instructions, the engine will flood and make it almost impossible to start. I'm now beginning to wonder if we just modify the starting instructions to get it to start, if the blower will work just fine. So once I get all this dirt and oil off the blower, we'll try and start it again, but just like the last time, we're not going to use the choke and see how it starts and runs. Well, we've got quite the situation with the carb. First off, it seems like it's giving too much fuel to the engine on startup, but after that, it's not able to deliver the correct amount of fuel when squeezing the trigger either. All this points to a carb that needs an inspection and more than likely a good cleaning and servicing, but there is one easy way to deal with this whole situation. The simple solution would be to just replace the carb, but if you're the adventurous type or love dealing with headaches, then you might consider trying to service the carb instead. Now, this design was so close to making it easy to service the carb until you realize that you have to remove part of the housing just to disconnect the throttle linkage. Also, this part that covers the muffler is separate from the rest of the cover, so it's important that you don't forget to replace it later on when you put it back together. And with the trigger and throttle linkage finally off the machine, we can now try and remove the carb off its studs. So the most likely reason for the carb to have little to no fuel control would be a metering diaphragm that's having some issues. And with the metering diaphragm off the carb, that's exactly what we find. Now its job is to control the flow of fuel through the carb by moving back and forth. However, this one is fully extended and not moving back to a neutral position. That's the reason why the carb is flooding the engine and not able to give the correct amount of fuel while squeezing the trigger. Of course, that means we need to try to replace this diaphragm, but if you're not able to get a new one and you have some time to spare, you can try to rejuvenate it. Now, this will not work if the diaphragm is completely petrified. However, if it's still somewhat flexible like this one, you might be able to save it. Now, the last part that I want to look at is under this metal plate, which is covering the pumping diaphragm. However, I rarely have any issues with this diaphragm, and instead, I'm mainly checking on whether or not the round inlet screen is clogged with any debris. And fortunately for us, this one is not clogged with any debris, and we can start to take the carb apart so that we can clean it in the ultrasonic cleaner. We also need to remove the fuel adjustment screws from the carb. However, we need to count how many clockwise turns it takes for them to stop first. That way, after the carb is clean, we can put them back on right where we found them at. Although more than likely, we'll end up making some adjustments to them just to get the blower working the way that it should. Once that's done, we can then carefully remove the needle and rocker arm along with the tiny spring from the carb. You'll have to be extremely careful when doing this because these parts can easily be lost, and if that happens, you might as well just buy a new carb. Like I said earlier, servicing a carb like this one can be very challenging, especially if you've never done it before. That's the reason why I would just recommend replacing it instead. So here's the new metering diaphragm, and as you can see, it's very flexible, which it needs to be to do its job. So after 2 cycles in the ultrasonic cleaner, the carb certainly looks a lot cleaner. However, you'll still need to blow out as many of the passages as possible before putting it back together. Now, once the carb is finally back together, there is one more item we need to check before we put the carb back onto the engine, and it's something that doesn't get checked as much as it should be. So this is the spark arrestor screen, and as its name implies, its job is to keep sparks from leaving the muffler and starting a fire. However, if enough carbon builds up on the screen, it can also block the exhaust gases from leaving the engine and causing it to struggle to get to full speed. Luckily for us, this one's not clogged in any way, so I'll just put it back into the muffler and move on to the installation of the carb. Now, some have stated that they have taken these screens out of their mufflers, but I'd recommend that you put them back on after inspecting and cleaning them. And the reason why is because the risk of personal injury or property damage is just too high, and besides that, it could take years for these screens to clog with any carbon, which means you may only have to do this once or twice in its lifetime. Also, while I have access, I'm going to spray some lubricant onto the posts for the starter poles just so that they'll keep working well for the next couple of years. Once that's done, I'll then start to put the blower back together, and hopefully this blower will work just like new afterwards. Now, I could have changed out the fuel lines while the carb was out of the way, but to be honest, the lines are still in great shape. However, having said that out loud, they're probably going to start breaking apart. Now, if you're not sure if your lines are still good, then I would just replace them. Now, when connecting the fuel lines, the line that goes back to the fuel tank will connect to the longer port on the back of the bulb. That means the fuel line that's coming from the carb will go to the shorter port on the bulb. Remember, the purpose of the bulb is to pull fuel from the tank through the carb and into the bulb and then return it back to the tank. And getting fuel to the carb before starting it makes it a lot easier to start with less of a chance of flooding it. Of course, that's assuming the carb works like it should. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that I made a terrible mistake while putting this blower back together, and I hate to say it, it always seems to happen when I work on this particular blower. Now, as you can see, I've forgotten to install the cover over the muffler. Now, the reason this is a problem is because it's held in place by the housing. That means I'll have to at least loosen most of the screws for the blower and the recoil assembly to have enough clearance to put it back in place, at least without taking the entire thing back apart. So as soon as I put the carb into partial choke, there's not enough fuel to keep the engine running. I'll try that again and see if I can get the same result. So it did run a second longer than the first time, but the result was the same. Now by the way it's acting, I feel as though it wants more fuel to stay running. And that's because the choke is basically giving more fuel to the engine by reducing the air, and with it in partial choke, it means less fuel. Now the screw closer to the engine is the L screw, and it's for low engine speed fuel adjustments. While the screw closer to the air filter is the H screw, and it's for high engine speed fuel adjustments, basically while the trigger is squeezed. Now since the engine is stopping while we're not even touching the trigger, we're going to make adjustments to the L screw, and we'll start with the quarter turn counterclockwise to increase fuel flow. So it looks like the blower is working a lot better, and it turns out the carb didn't need too much adjusting to get it back to where it needed to be. The first real hurdle is to just make sure it stays running long enough to make your adjustments, which I have to say can be the tricky part. So basically, in the end, I turned both screws counterclockwise about a quarter turn each to get it to stay running and run well at full speed. Now I do want to mention that just because you bought a new carb, it might still need some fine tuning on the screws to get it to work with an engine that has some wear on it. But most times the new carb should be tuned to a default setting to allow your engine to start and run without any changes. Now to be honest, I really do like this blower, however I find working on it can be a real pain because of the way it's designed. Now it's not a bad design, but having to take the blower apart to take the carb off to service it is rather annoying, but it's not enough to make me get a different blower though. So how did this blower get into this condition in the first place? Well, if you haven't guessed it, it was not maintained very well during the off-season. So my recommendation is to read and follow the instructions in the owner's manual on how to maintain it during the off-season, and that should help to keep it working for quite some time. So my question is, would you get a blower like this one after seeing what I had to go through to clean and service the carb, or would you get a different brand instead? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.